Welcome. I am Ann Muley, the Associate Director of the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance at the University of Delaware. The Weinberg Center is pleased to present a discussion on the role of the General Counsel and how she should be positively influencing corporate culture. We have been working with the Association of Corporate Counsel to examine this issue in light of their recent research and white paper on the topic. The Association of Corporate Counsel, or ACC, is a global bar association with more than 43,000 in-house counsel members worldwide. Why is this an important topic? There have been several recent compliance and ethical breakdowns at some very large companies, VW and Wells Fargo, to name a few. It has been said that the problems at these companies have part of their root in the company's corporate culture. Before we begin our discussion, I want to state up front that the issues we will be focusing on today are very important governance issues for companies, boards, and investors. The ACC white paper that you will soon be hearing about states that given the importance of the General Counsel in matters of ethics, compliance, corporate governance, and risk and reputation management, the General Counsel should be a key ally and partner in establishing a corporate culture that supports corporate performance without compromising ethical behavior and legal and regulatory compliance. Today, we are honored to have two guests who are intimately familiar with the partnership that should occur between the General Counsel and the Board of Directors to influence corporate culture. I would like to briefly introduce each of them. Please note that their complete bios are posted on our website. Vida Richardson is President and CEO of the Association of Corporate Counsel. For 4 consecutive years, she has been named to the NACD's Directorship 100 as one of the most influential leaders in the boardroom and corporate governance community. Her own expertise was shaped through more than a decade as in-house counsel at Sunoco, Inc., where her practice focus was corporate governance, transactions, securities disclosure, and finance. Welcome, Vida.
Thank you.
Gloria Santona recently stepped down as Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of McDonald's after 3 decades at the company. During that time, she worked closely with McDonald's independent board of directors as their liaison to senior management. Gloria also has served as an independent director of Aon Corporation since 2004. Welcome, Gloria.
Thank you.
Finally, as I stated earlier, I am Ann Muley, Associate Director of the Weinberg Center. Prior to joining the center, I served as the Chief Governance Officer, Chief Corporate and Securities Counsel, and Corporate Secretary to the Board of Directors of Sunoco, Inc., where I had the pleasure of working with Sunoco's board and board committees for many years, and also had the distinct pleasure of working with Vida during her time at Sunoco. Let's now begin our discussion. ACC recently issued a report leveraging legal leadership, the General Counsel as a corporate culture influencer. Vida, why did the ACC decide to do this white paper?
Well, just as you said, Ann, in corporate governance circles, the issue of corporate culture has become much more of a hot topic. And certainly the scandals that you mentioned really underscored that and prompted a lot of discussion. But at ACC, as we listened to the discussion unfold, it struck us that the General Counsel is a key ally to the Board of Directors and to the executive team in helping to set that correct tone from the top. But as we looked at the body of discourse, we didn't see a whole lot of time being spent examining the role of the General Counsel and how to make sure that position is empowered with the access and information that it needs to really be that true ally and help set the right tone from the top. So as ACC examined it, we were surprised to see that not all General Counsel report directly to the CEO, and not all of them have direct access to the board. So we see that as an issue that boards need to discuss and have pay more attention to in order to make sure that the General Counsel is really well positioned to be their ally.
So, Vita, can you now provide a brief summary of the findings of the white paper?
Yeah, definitely. The paper is premised, on the fact that the General Counsel is a natural ally to the board. And clearly the board is entrusted with responsibility to make sure that they set the right tone from the top and that the company focuses in compliance, legality, being ethical, doing the right thing. And the General Counsel is the officer within the company that is best positioned to help the board have a window into what they need to know so that they can make sure that they execute those responsibilities well. But we also see that not always does the General Counsel have that critical seat at the table. And so this paper is really about amplifying the importance of the General Counsel having a seat, and a seat at both the Board of Directors table, regularly attending board meetings, as well as at the Chief Executive's table, participating proactively on strategy. We also feel as though that when the CEO may have the General Counsel reporting in a different capacity, that may be something that the board wants to be a little bit more inquisitive about. So that's one aspect of the paper. We also believe that the General Counsel has to be properly positioned, and that means making sure that there is a structure that allows information about what's going on in subsidiaries to all flow up to the General Counsel. And as we examined it, we came up with 5 basic principles that we think are important for corporations to focus on.
Well, thank you. So now let's take a more detailed look at the 5 indicators in the ACC white paper that should be used by CEOs, boards, and investors to assess whether a company's General Counsel is well positioned to have a sufficient influence on corporate culture and whether the corporate culture itself is indeed healthy. The first indicator is the General Counsel reports directly to the CEO and is considered part of the executive management team. Vita, the ACC has done an annual survey of CLOs, Chief Legal Officers, or General Counsel, since 2004. What were the findings regarding the GC reporting relationships comparing 2004 to 2017?
Yes, well, you'll be surprised, Ann, that when we went back and pulled the data from 2004, back in 2004, 64% of all General Counsel reported directly to the CEO. And 13 years later, in 2017, when we looked at it, things had not really advanced as significantly as we would like. In fact, the needle moved less than 10%. So that now 72% of all General Counsel have a direct reporting relationship to the CEO. So that tells us that more than a quarter still don't. And we see that as a big problem.
So Gloria, let's turn it over to you for a little bit. Describe your working relationship experience as a General Counsel. How did it work and not work?
So as General Counsel, I was very fortunate to have direct reporting to the CEO from the outset. And that was great because he made me a member of our senior management team. And I was at the table because we think it's very important to have a seat at the table. And that was one of the pillars of our strategic plan for our legal department, that we wanted all of our lawyers to have a seat at their client's table so that they would have an opportunity to be heard. So that worked extremely well. I also had the good fortune, after being General Counsel 2 or 3 years, of having an independent chairman. So prior to that, we had a lead director with whom I had a relationship. But once we had an independent chairman who spent a fair amount of time with the company, and I got to know him better and have a relationship, it allowed me to have that ability to speak to him in a very direct way, as well as to speak to the CEO. And obviously, you need to balance what you do in order to maintain the relationships that you have to have. But I think having an independent chairman was really important.
So now let's move to your experience as a board member, because you've been on the AON board for quite some time. What has been your experience with regard to overseeing the General Counsel in your capacity as a board member? Talk about the reporting relationships, and again, what do you recommend? And then maybe just touch on the potential risk of having the GC report to someone else in the C-suite, say the CFO.
Sure. Well, I think actually Aon has a very similar structure to what we had at McDonald's. And so the General Counsel has consistently reported to the CEO. Early on in my tenure as a director at Aon, we had an independent chairman as well. And so he has access to both. And I think that's really a very nice balance, because you have an independent chairman who spends a fair amount of time with the company getting to understand it. And consequently, you have an opportunity to develop a relationship that's a little bit deeper and more influential than you might if you had just a lead director, I think. So I really believe it's the best practice. It's as a general counsel, it's a very much more comfortable way to operate than it would be if you were reporting to someone in an intervening place. I do think there's a huge amount of risk if you're reporting to, say, a CFO in particular. Right. I think is a problem post Sarbanes-Oxley. But the fact is that whenever you're reporting to someone else, if you're providing legal advice, then that person turns around and provides legal advice to someone else, and they're a non-lawyer talking to a non-lawyer. You have privilege issues, obviously, and then the message might get distorted, not intentionally, but because you have people who really don't understand the legalities that they need to be explaining.
Well, excellent. So let's move on to the second indicator in the report, which is the General Counsel has regular contact with the Board of Directors. Vita, can you share ACC's findings regarding GCs attending board meetings?
Yes. Well, I will say there again, we don't see the needle moving the way that it should. And about 67% of General Counsel tell us that they almost always attend the board meetings. Well, that tells us that a good percentage don't. And the fact that they seldom have access to the board should send a red flag to the board, because the General Counsel, is their ally to understand what's going on within the organization in terms of legality, compliance with laws, rules, and regulations. And so it's very important that they have a relationship with the General Counsel, and you can't really have a relationship with someone that you don't have regular access to.
I mean, I'll be honest, when I read that, I was shocked by that finding, which was part of the reason why we decided to move forward and work on this area, because it's really an area that directors and investors really need to ask the right questions and focus on. Gloria, from your experience, I'm going to ask you 3 questions in a row. So here's the first one. Did you, as the GC, regularly attend both board meetings and board committee meetings? Because we know a lot of the work of the board gets done at the board committee level. And what did the GC actually do at these meetings? Could you talk about that?
I was corporate secretary as well as being general counsel, which is somewhat the norm, but not present everywhere. So as corporate secretary, obviously, I had to be at all the board meetings, but as general counsel, I would periodically report on litigation matters, regulatory issues that arose, but I didn't have a regular reporting. However, as corporate secretary, I was at all the meetings. I was responsible for the planning, the agendas. I would work with the chairman of the various committees, putting agendas together, and obviously recording minutes of the meetings. At the end of the day, I couldn't attend all the committee meetings because a lot of them ran concurrently, but a member of my staff would attend each of the meetings. And so that way I had a finger on what was going on, a finger on the pulse of what was going on throughout the company. And that was really important to have. So I've forgotten your second question.
No, I didn't answer the second question yet. So The second question is, and I think this is really an important question, did you ever meet an executive session with the board? In other words, it would be, for the purpose of the people in our audience, by that I mean just you and the board members, no other members of senior management there, either at the board level or with one of the board committees. And why is meeting an executive session so important?
Well, executive session is when you have the opportunity to talk directly to the board in a way that's really unfettered. You aren't concerned about who else might be in the room with you from senior management, et cetera. So with respect to executive sessions of the board, I would occasionally attend them when there was a matter that needed the general counsel's input. With respect to the audit committee, I would attend all the audit committee meetings, and there was always an executive session with management, which would typically be the CFO and myself. Occasionally, if I needed to have a private conversation with the rest of the audit committee, I'd tell the CFO in advance, sorry, I have another matter I have to raise with them, and he would depart, and I would have a separate executive session. So it was a little bit ad hoc, but I had as much access as I needed whenever I needed it.
That's great. Go ahead. Absolutely.
I was going to say that as Gloria was speaking, it struck me how important it was for her to have the great relationship with her peers.
Absolutely.
And the
Trust
credibility
and
that the general counsel role has.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. So the last of the three questions.
Okay, good.
Did you have contact with board members outside of the board meetings? And if so, in what way? And why is that important?
Well, I think a well-run board typically arranges for situations where senior management will meet with the board outside of board meetings. Typically, it might be at a board luncheon or a board dinner, and that sort of thing, occasionally presenting to the board on matters if you're not someone who's typically at a meeting. So I think it's critically important because you have to have that relationship. And how do you establish the relationship if the only time they see you is when you're reading from your notes in a board meeting? And so those dinners are opportunities to sit down, get to know each other on a personal level, and develop some confidence. They develop confidence in you, and they get to know a little bit about you. And you also develop an opportunity to get to know them a little bit, and then realize that if a situation arises where you need to talk to someone who's outside of senior management, you do have an ear that will be receptive to you.
Thank you. So let's move on to the third indicator, and that is the general counsel is viewed as independent from management. The ACC white paper states that the general counsel should be seen as the senior executive most capable of pushing back on management decisions that put the company at legal or reputational risk. And there must be a willingness by the GC to raise issues with the board, even if in doing so it may threaten her own standing with the CEO and other executives. Gloria, what has been your experience? How can a director support the independence of the GC, and how hard is it to strike the right balance?
Well, striking the balance is definitely an art and not a science, and it's critically important. I will say I had the good fortune, as I said, to work for an independent chairman, and at one point he said to me, Gloria, you don't have a vote in the boardroom, but you do have a voice, and I expect you to use it. And I think that was just a wonderful encouragement to do what I thought was right. And knowing that you have that support, it makes it easier to go into the boardroom in occasions where it's uncomfortable. But clearly you need to strike the balance because you need to be part of the CEO's team. You can't be running around behind the CEO's back talking to the independent chairman. And so it really is a situation that involves very good judgment and a lot of thoughtfulness before you approach an issue. So you don't just run into one office or the other without having thought through the whole the course of events that can potentially take place and what the best way is to handle it.
Thank you. I love that line. Don't have a vote, but you have a voice. I think that says a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to the fourth indicator. And the fourth indicator is the general counsel is expected to advise on issues that extend beyond the traditional legal realm, including ethics, reputation, management, and public policy. Vita, please describe the white paper's discussion about this area.
Yes. Well, what we've seen at ACC is the role of the general counsel and the evolution of the role expanding. General counsel now, under their ambit, have responsibility for public affairs, for government relations. They can oversee communications functions, be responsible, even we've seen increasingly corporate social responsibility. So they're very much having an expanded position, even in terms of crisis management, that is really more about assisting and managing risk, with the corporation. And so as the role expands and the general counsel is, increasingly becoming a more central role, these are the areas where companies have significant exposure potentially, especially with social media when stories can take on a life of their own. And as a result, we feel as though that the board needs to have that critical relationship with the General Counsel, and then it's really a matter of making sure that they have their arms around the issue and are able to set the tone from the top in terms of how those issues should be managed and influencing their culture.
So Gloria, what has been your experience and what are your views in this area with regard to the fourth indicator?
I do agree that the General Counsel has an interesting seat and is able to see across the entire organization in a way that I think most others cannot see. And so it's a very influential role, and it really depends on what the General Counsel makes of it. So you may have expanded reporting, as Vita mentioned. I, for one, felt I had a lot within my own sphere of influence, but I had compliance and risk reporting to me, so it was an opportunity to impact the organization in that regard. But the fact was, I was a member of the top management team. If there were issues of risk, if the strategy and how it related to legal issues, I was at the table and talking about them. And so I think it isn't as important whether you have a bunch of departments reporting to you or not, as to what influence you exert. And so in all the areas that Vita mentioned and more, I was definitely someone who was a force that needed to be heard and that needed to understand what was going on. And so I think it is clearly an opportunity for General Counsel to expand beyond the traditional norms.
Well, thank you. So now let's move on to the fifth indicator. That is, business units regularly include the legal department as opposed to just the GC in decision making. So Vita, please describe the white paper's analysis of this indicator.
Well, there again, it's our belief that the legal department, the lawyers, the General Counsel have to really have a seat at the table, and they have to be able to participate and assist in the business decisions as well as on the execution side, as well. And so this is what will ensure that the right legal and risk-related considerations are taken into account as they chart the path, that the company's going to follow. And all of that discussion doesn't just take place, at the top levels, but it also flows through all of the business units. And the law department, the lawyers within it, are counsel to those business units, and they need to have positions of credibility and respect so that people are involving them at the front end. Because what happens when they aren't involved in the front end is that things can happen, and then the lawyers are chasing behind and trying to clean up a problem instead of having been at the table to help craft the decisions and prevent a problem from taking place.
Well said. Gloria, please describe your experience as a GC with regard to your legal department.
As a General Counsel, you're as good as your team. And you can be the strongest General Counsel and have a seat at the table, and if no one on your team has a seat at the table, you're not really going to be as effective as you can be. So we had a strategic plan, and one of our pillars was about having a seat at the table. And so from the outset, our young lawyers would have clients, and we'd say, we'd like you to have a seat at their table. And that might be a very small table, but it was a table, and it created the opportunity for them to have the mindset that they needed to be proactive, that they needed to partner in terms of strategic intent, but also be the lawyer and make sure that things were being done in a way that was legally compliant and compliant with regulations. So it's critically important, and something that I really instilled in my lawyers from a very, very early stage, that you needed to have that seat at the table. Made me much more confident that I was doing my job well and effectively, made me more confident because I knew that if issues arose that were beyond the capability of that lawyer, that it would come up the ladder, and eventually it would rise to me if it couldn't be dealt with at a lower level in the organization. So, as I said, a critically important thing to be a successful General Counsel.
So, Vita, can you talk about what I'm going to add as a sixth indicator, and what I will blithely call the garbage in, garbage out indicator? And by that I mean, if the GC is not receiving the right information from the lawyers in the company, sometimes due to the lack of a direct internal reporting relationship to the GC, due to a decentralized business unit structure, then even if all of the other previous indicators are good. In other words, the GC reports directly to the CEO, attends all board and committee meetings, etc., it's going to be garbage in to the GC and garbage out from the GC to the CEO and the board. So Vita, can you talk about this important area?
Yeah. Well, I agree with you, Ann, and I think for boards and for CEOs to think about the potential that they would have garbage, being delivered into them, or be proceeding without full information about what's going on within the organization as a whole, it's a very risky proposition. And so what we believe is that while different organizations have all different types of reporting structures, what we do believe is that division general counsel need to have at least a dotted line or some type of relationship, if not direct, to the general counsel. But more so than that, they need to have a sense of responsibility that they're required to keep the general counsel informed. They need to make sure that the actions that they take are consistent with policies that are set by the general counsel organization-wide, not to act in conflict with that. And sometimes we see that literally and figuratively, division general counsel can sometimes get a little bit too close to the division president or division CEO, and they can have a potential schism with the general counsel and not really think as proactively as they should about what she needs to know. And so we believe that notwithstanding whatever structure that they may choose to create, that there needs to be a supervisory role for the chief legal officer so that those who are in division still have a responsibility to report up.
So Gloria, did all of the lawyers in your business units and subsidiaries report in to you as GC directly via a dotted line? How did that work at McDonald's?
So it started out as a dotted line and ended up as a direct line. But a dotted line, comes in a lot of forms. There's a lot of just different distances between the dots. I think the most important thing that I found was the ability to hire and fire. And that if you had that, the fact that you had direct line reporting or not was not quite so important. But beyond that, it was establishing those relationships with those attorneys who were at a general counsel level on the divisional end of things to understand that they do have an obligation to the general counsel and a reinforcement of that. So I can only echo, what Vita said with respect to the importance of having that kind of reporting, whether the line's dotted or direct, either way.
So then let's move to your role as an independent director of Aon, and in that role, what can a director ask to determine if the GC is well positioned to obtain the necessary information that she needs?
I think it's part of the overall discussion that goes on with the general counsel through different committee meetings and through the board meeting. I think you get a sense of whether that general counsel is well positioned or not. And general counsel, I think, has an obligation, if they don't feel well positioned, to make that known. So you don't want to micromanage as a director. You don't want to tell them this is the best way to structure a legal department. But you do want to ask enough questions that you can determine whether or not it seems as though there's some renegade lawyers over here, some renegade lawyers over there, who really aren't responsive to the general counsel and his or her needs.
Thank you. So before we close, I would like to ask each of you to provide a few brief comments or takeaways for those who are watching this webcast. And I'd like to start with you, Gloria.
Sure. Well, I think, as a director, I think it's really important to make sure that you have a general counsel who has the right mindset with regard to corporate ethics. That's really critical. But beyond that, I think you need to make sure that the general counsel is effective, because you can have someone who has the right mindset who is not accepted within the culture and really can't make a difference. And so I think it behooves the director to make sure that they have a general counsel that has both of those qualities. And as a general counsel, I go back to what I was told by our independent chairman at one point about having a voice and the importance of using that voice. And he made it very clear that he felt that I was obligated to do that. If he hadn't said that, I still would have felt it, but I wouldn't have felt I had quite as much of license to do it. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind that you do have an obligation to raise your voice when you think things need to be addressed.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask you, Vita, for some of your closing comments.
Yes. Well, again, I think that this issue of corporate culture is going to continue to be a hot topic. And if you consider that the National Association of Corporate Directors recently issued its Blue Ribbon Commission report on the topic of corporate culture, I think that will also continue to make it front and center. But from ACC's perspective, we believe that the issue of the General Counsel and how the General Counsel can be an ally to the board and to management in making sure that the tone from the top regarding that culture says the right things and that the corporation is really behaving and doing the things that it needs to do. And as a result, in order for the General Counsel to be best positioned to be that critical ally, it entails having a seat at the chief executive's table, using, as Gloria said, your voice at that table, as well as having direct access to the board and using your voice, amplifying your voice when necessary in order to make sure that the board receives the advice and information that they need in order to do their job well.
Well said, both of you, very well said. Given the risks that an unethical corporate culture can create for a company, it is important from a governance perspective that companies, boards, and investors focus on the critical role of the General Counsel as a corporate culture influencer and ally. It is highly recommended that companies, directors, and investors use the 5 indicators, or the 6, as we discussed today, from the ACC white paper to assess whether the company's General Counsel is positioned to have a sufficient influence on corporate culture. If she is not well positioned, quick and decisive action should be taken by the CEO and/or by the board in their oversight role. I would like to thank Vita and Gloria for joining us today. It has been quite informative, and we at the Weinberg Center are very appreciative that they have taken time out of their busy schedules and provided insights into an extremely important governance topic. Before we sign off, I would like to note that the ACC white paper we referred to today will be posted on the Weinberg Center's website, www.weinberg.udel.edu. Additionally, I wanted to mention that the Weinberg Center and ACC co-hosted a program that actually Gloria participated in last April on campus on VW and other corporate breakdowns. The program focused on what went wrong at those companies and lessons learned. Videos of interviews with some of the individual participants, as well as relevant materials, are also available on the Weinberg Center's website. We hope that you have found our webcast to be of value. Please feel free to share this video with your company, board, investors, and others who may find it to be of interest. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.